"Sir, that piano is reserved for hotel performers only." Those were the first words spoken to Elliot Marsh before he sat at a dusty piano in a luxury hotel lobby, alone, unnoticed, and carrying nothing but a worn satchel and a melody he couldn't forget. Within minutes, the room fell silent, and when the final note echoed, no one knew who he was, or why the world's most reclusive composer Daniel Atwood stood behind him in tears. What followed was a breathtaking unraveling of grief, memory, and music long buried. A secret composition, a forgotten brother, a sister's final message, and a revelation that would change how the world understood legacy forever. This is the story of how one man's quiet truth brought a lost melody back to life and helped the world finally listen. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. "Sir, I'm afraid that piano is reserved for hotel performers only." The concierge's voice sliced through the chatter of the opulent lobby like a knife through silk, polite but cold enough to bruise. Heads turned slightly, but no one stopped to help. The man he was addressing, tall, slightly hunched, dressed in a faded wool coat that had seen far too many winters, paused with his hand resting gently on the closed lid of the grand piano. He didn't flinch, he didn't argue. He simply nodded and sat down anyway. A hush followed, not loud enough to silence the lobby, but noticeable, like the sharp intake of breath before a storm. He looked out of place. Among the marble pillars, golden chandeliers, and perfume-thick air, Elliot Marsh might as well have been an old painting hung in the wrong museum. His shoes were scuffed, soles frayed. His satchel, patched and sagging, rested at his feet like a tired dog. Even his presence seemed too quiet for the setting, as if he were holding something back. Still, there was something in his gaze, a calm defiance, a sorrow too proud to speak. The concierge hesitated, then turned away, muttering something under his breath about calling security. But Elliot didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He opened the lid of the Steinway with reverence, like a man greeting an old friend after years of silence. His fingers hovered for a moment above the keys, not trembling, not hesitant, but simply waiting, as if the piano itself needed a moment to remember him. Then came the first note. Soft, hollow, beautiful. Not flashy, not even particularly complex. Just a single tone, hanging in the air like the scent of something long forgotten. And then another, and another. A melody began to form, slow and mournful, like a lullaby sung in a war zone. It was the kind of music that doesn't demand attention, but draws it in anyway. A nearby guest, scrolling through her phone, paused, her brow furrowed. Something about the sound pulled at her chest. Then another man, sipping scotch at the bar, looked up and blinked. And then the lobby began to shift. The room didn't go silent all at once. It was more like the lights dimming before a curtain rises. Conversation stumbled, glasses stopped clinking. Even the lobby's fountain seemed to hush itself out of respect. People turned, slowly at first, then more directly. Who was he? Where had this sound come from? Elliot didn't look at anyone. He didn't play for them. He played for something else. Something distant, something buried. In the corner, a child wandered from her family's luggage pile and stood just a few feet from the piano, eyes wide, jaw slack. She didn't understand the music, but she felt it. It tugged at the air like gravity. The concierge returned, this time with a suited supervisor whose face read corporate concern. "We really should stop this," the man muttered, tugging at his tie. "The guests?" But one guest nearby raised her hand gently. "Leave him," she said. "Please." Her name was Isabel Hart. She wore a black dress that fell like smoke around her. Her face was calm, elegant, but her eyes weren't listening to the music. They were remembering it. Because the melody Elliot played wasn't just beautiful, it was familiar. A ripple passed through her body, grief and awe braided tightly together. Her fingers curled into her palm as the refrain twisted into something heartbreaking. Isabel turned to the concierge. "Where did he come from?" she whispered. The man shrugged helplessly. The piece grew bolder, deeper. Still no flourishes, no showmanship. Just raw, deliberate notes that stabbed and soothed at once. It felt like the sound of walking through snowfall at night, like reading the final line of a letter you were never meant to see. Isabel stepped closer. Every note wrapped around her ribs like vines. She hadn't heard this melody in years. Not since. No. It couldn't be. It was unfinished. She had spent the last decade in and out of cultural summits and elite music galas, and not once had she heard this piece because it had never been performed. It had been abandoned, left like a relic in the wake of a tragedy that had torn the heart out of the world's greatest living composer. A composer who had vanished from the public eye. And yet, this man, this stranger in a threadbare coat, was playing it like it had been etched into his bones. By now, the entire lobby was still. Staff behind the desk leaned forward, mouths slightly agape. Guests who had been checking in stopped mid-signature. Children clung to their parents, hands watching Elliot as if he were casting a spell. The song reached a place no one expected, an unfamiliar passage, one that had never been recorded, a section not even Isabel recognized. "Who is he?" someone asked behind her. No one answered. The security team finally arrived, alerted by the concierge's earlier call. But before they could step forward, Isabel turned, voice sharp but steady. "Don't touch him." One of the guards, tall and stocky, looked puzzled. "Ma'am, we were told." "I outrank whoever told you," she said, flipping open her ID with swift authority. Presidential Office of Cultural Affairs. The seal gleamed like a warning. They backed off. The manager looked at her helplessly. "What is going on?" Isabel didn't answer. She was staring now, eyes narrowing at the man seated at the piano. At the way his shoulders moved with the rhythm. At the way his left hand lingered on the lower register like it was mourning someone it couldn't reach. He was no amateur. His touch was too intimate, too lived in. But he also wasn't performing. Not in the traditional sense. He was remembering. Or maybe grieving. Elliot finally looked up. Just for a moment. And that's when Isabel saw them, his eyes. She gasped. The music faltered for a half-second. Not because he made a mistake, but because someone had just walked in and taken a seat directly behind him. And in that moment, everything changed. Every guest who had been watching Elliot now turned their gaze, their breaths caught in unison, and those who knew froze. Sitting behind Elliot in silence, his hands clasped together, was a man the world hadn't seen in nearly 12 years. A man who had turned his back on music, on fame, on everything. Daniel Atwood, the ghost of modern composition. The man whose final, unfinished piece had haunted concert halls for over a decade was now listening to it, completed, played by a stranger who looked like he had walked out of a forgotten memory. And Daniel was crying. For a long moment, Daniel Atwood didn't move. He simply sat there, back straight, eyes glistening, his breath shallow and caught in the chest like a man holding on to something that might vanish if he exhaled. Every person in the lobby was watching him now. But he wasn't watching them. His gaze was fixed on Elliot, on the back of that threadbare coat, on the way those fingers, aged but agile, danced over the ivory keys like they knew his soul. Elliot kept playing, though he knew. He felt the presence behind him the way you feel a storm before it breaks, a hush in the air, a charge in the silence. He could hear the shift in the room, the gravity collapsing inward, and he knew exactly who had taken that seat. But he didn't turn. He couldn't. Not yet, because the song wasn't done. Because this song had waited too long to be heard. And because once he looked at the man behind him, the past would no longer be a secret, and the truth would flood the floor like spilled wine at a funeral. So he kept playing. The notes grew more tender, more cautious, as if his hands were touching memories instead of keys. There was a fragility now, a trembling beneath the melody like glass trying not to shatter. The music slowed, dipping into aching lows and soft suspended highs, and every ear in the room clung to each breath of silence between the notes. Daniel's fingers twitched in his lap. He recognized the structure, the framework of the composition. It was his, undoubtedly. The rising fifths, the subtle dissonance resolving into impossible grace. This was the piece he had tried and failed to finish after Amara died. But Elliot had finished it. No, not finished. He had understood it, completed it in a way Daniel never could. And the ending, it was everything Daniel had been too broken to imagine. It didn't defy the pain, it embraced it. It didn't resist the grief, it folded it into a quiet, dignified peace. There was no triumph here, only surrender, a beautiful, sacred surrender. A sound that felt like forgiveness. Elliot's foot lifted off the sustain pedal. The final chord lingered, shivering in the air and then dissolved into the lobby's stunned stillness. And then he turned. Their eyes met. Neither man said a word. They didn't need to. Years of silence, sorrow, and searching crashed together in the space between them, a wordless reunion wrapped in music and pain. Daniel rose slowly, the weight of the past pressing into every joint. He took a step closer. The crowd parted instinctively, like waves retreating from shore. "You knew her," Daniel said softly. Not a question. Elliot nodded once. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, like the whisper of a cello string. "She was my sister." Gasps rippled across the room, but Elliot barely heard them. "She taught me that melody when I was 16, said you'd written it for her, but never finished it. She used to hum it when she cooked, when she cleaned, when she cried." His eyes drifted toward the keys. "I never forgot it." Daniel closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked older than he had just minutes ago. Not just older, hollowed out as if grief had carved through him like wind over stone. "She told me once," Elliot continued, "that if anything ever happened to her, to keep playing it, to keep her alive through the music. I didn't understand then, not fully, but when she died." He paused, swallowing the lump that rose suddenly in his throat. "I played it every year, same day, same time, wherever I was." Daniel stepped forward, his hand reaching out, hovering over Elliot's shoulder, but not touching yet. His voice cracked. "I tried for months after she passed. I locked myself in the studio. I screamed at that piano. I drank. I tore the pages apart, but I couldn't finish it because I didn't want to say goodbye." Elliot nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "I didn't finish it either," he whispered. "It finished me." Daniel let out a breath that seemed to deflate him entirely. He looked around, suddenly aware that 100 eyes were still watching, but he no longer cared. "I spent 12 years running from that melody," Daniel said, almost to himself. "And today, it found me." The room was quiet in a reverent, breathless way, as though everyone knew they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see but couldn't look away. A woman's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Atwood, will you play it with him?" It was Isabel. Her voice was calm, respectful, and trembling. Daniel looked at Elliot. Elliot looked at the piano. And then, without a word, Daniel stepped around and took the seat beside him. They sat shoulder to shoulder. Two men bound not by fame or fortune, but by a woman they both loved and lost. Their hands hovered over the keys. Daniel struck the first chord. Elliot answered, and together they played. The melody rose again, this time deeper, more whole, as if the soul of Amara herself had returned through the music to witness her two grief-stricken brothers, one by blood, one by love, find peace in her memory. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of hesitation, of missed timing, of breaths caught too long, but it was real, it was raw, and it was devastatingly beautiful. Guests wiped tears from their eyes openly now. Some filmed, most didn't dare. They knew this wasn't a performance, this was something sacred, a reunion carved in sound. A requiem not just for the dead, but for the years lost to grief and guilt. As the final note lingered again, Daniel reached across and laid his hand over Elliot's. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "For what? For remembering her better than I did." The silence after was not empty. It was full of everything that had been unsaid for 12 years. Then, without warning, the lobby erupted into applause. Not wild, not loud, but honest, slow, rising, deep. The kind of applause that says we saw something we'll never forget. Daniel stood and bowed his head. Elliot did not stand. He only looked down at the keys one last time, as if saying goodbye to someone he loved. And then he closed the piano lid, softly, finally. Outside, the world moved on. Cars rolled through intersections. Voices drifted from the cafe across the street, and the sky painted itself in a soft dusk gold. But inside the lobby of the Astoria Grand, time clung to the air like perfume. Elliot remained seated at the piano, his hand resting gently on the closed lid, as if parting from a friend he hadn't expected to see again. Daniel stood beside him, no longer the mythic composer or the tortured recluse, but simply a man, stripped of posture, stripped of reputation, watching a wound close in real time, uncertain whether the healing would hurt more than the cut. A few guests lingered near the corners of the room, too moved to leave, too respectful to stay close. Staff members whispered in corridors, unsure of protocol now that history had taken place on their floor. Somewhere, someone was calling the press. Somewhere else, a violinist in a suite upstairs leaned against her door, weeping, not knowing why. Isabel stepped forward slowly. Her heels clicked gently against the marble floor like a metronome counting down to something delicate. She carried with her a quiet strength, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself with noise but with clarity. Her eyes, however, were soft and reddened, betraying the composure her posture demanded. "I knew Amara," she said gently, as if offering a key to a door no one else could open. "We studied together. Conservatory in Vienna. She was the only person I ever saw argue with Daniel and win." Daniel smiled faintly, the memory brushing past his lips like a ghost. "She said music wasn't about structure," Isabel continued, looking toward the piano. "She said it was about memory. That when you play, you're not just performing, you're remembering out loud." Elliot's gaze lifted, meeting hers. There was something heavy behind his eyes, but also something freed, like a man who'd been carrying a song in his chest for years and had finally exhaled. "She was right," he murmured. Daniel turned slightly toward Isabel. "How long were you here? When did you realize?" "I knew the melody the second he began to play," she replied. "But when he added the second refrain, the one you abandoned in '08, I knew he hadn't just heard it. He'd lived it." Daniel nodded slowly, as though the pieces of a puzzle long buried were fitting together at last, and then his voice lowered. "There's something I need to ask." Elliot looked up. Daniel hesitated. The great composer who had once commanded orchestras with a flick of his hand now struggled to form a sentence. "That photograph you showed me," he said. "The one with her." Elliot reached down and carefully removed the worn satchel from beneath the bench. He opened it and drew out the picture again, sliding it carefully onto the closed lid of the piano. It was creased at the corners, the colors faded with time, but the image remained unmistakable. Amara, laughing, arms around a teenage boy with messy curls and oversized glasses. "That was the last photo I ever took with her," Elliot said quietly. "It was 3 months before she left for her last tour." Daniel stared at it, his eyes sinking deep into the moment frozen in that image. "I never knew she had a brother." "She didn't tell many people," Elliot replied. "She wanted to protect me, said her world was too sharp for someone like me." Daniel's shoulders dropped as if a truth had finally pierced the armor of his guilt. "She was protecting me too," he said softly. Elliot nodded. "She always was." The three stood in silence, bound not by obligation but by memory. The lobby faded around them, and for a long, sacred moment, it felt like Amara herself was present, woven into the chords that still echoed faintly in the walls, painted across the light that filtered through the tall windows, suspended in the space between two men who had both lost her and just found each other. It was Isabel who broke the moment. "Elliot," she said, voice measured, "do you still perform?" He smiled faintly. "Not professionally." "Why not?" He looked around the room. Its grandeur, its gleaming floors and marble pillars, the chandeliers that dangled like frozen tears, and then back at her. "Because rooms like this don't open their doors to men who carry their lives in threadbare coats." Her lips parted, as if to argue, but Daniel spoke first. "Then maybe it's time they did." Elliot turned to him. Daniel stepped forward, placing both hands flat on the piano's lid. "That melody, the one you carried, was more than just music. It was legacy. It was grief, memory, and resurrection. You didn't just play it, you honored it." "I didn't do it for applause," Elliot replied. "I know," Daniel said. "That's why it mattered." Then Daniel's eyes locked on Isabel's. "Let's bring him to the stage." Her brow lifted. "You mean?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Let's finish the piece, properly. Let the world hear it." Isabel blinked, caught off guard by the weight of the offer. "At Carnegie?" "No," Daniel said. "Carnegie comes after." He looked back at Elliot. "We start in Vienna." Elliot blinked. "Vienna?" Daniel nodded. "That's where it began. That's where we debut the final version of Amara's song. We open the stage with the brother she never got to share it with." Elliot said nothing for a long time. His eyes shimmered again, not from sorrow this time, but from the slow, careful unfurling of disbelief. He'd spent years playing to ghosts, to strangers, to empty benches and forgotten keys. And now, the world's greatest living composer was inviting him to finish a story the world thought ended in silence. "But I'm not," Elliot began. Daniel raised a hand. "You are." Isabel stepped closer, offering her hand. "We'll arrange everything." Elliot looked at her hand, then at Daniel, then at the photograph that still sat quietly on the piano. For the first time in years, he smiled with something real in his eyes. "I never wanted the spotlight," he said. "You don't need it." Daniel replied, "You are the light." Behind them, a few guests began clapping again, not because they were expected to, but because they had witnessed a resurrection. Not of a person, not of a career, but of a song that had been buried beneath grief, silence, and regret, and had finally been sung again. The piano bench creaked as Elliot stood. He folded the photo carefully and placed it in his coat. "All right," he said softly. "I'll play." The snow fell like whispers over the city of Vienna, soft and unhurried, blanketing the streets in a delicate hush that felt almost sacred. Evening cast long shadows across the Baroque architecture, golden street lamps flickering like candles left burning for someone still missing. The world-famous Musikverein sat poised on the corner of Bosendorfer Strasse and Elegance, its gilded columns glowing beneath the winter sky. Inside, the great hall was empty, for now. Elliot Marsh stood at the edge of the stage, staring up into the cavernous ceiling, his hands folded loosely behind his back. Rows upon rows of velvet seats waited silently before him. They reminded him not of prestige, but of expectation, and he had spent most of his life hiding from that. He wore a simple suit, newly tailored but modest, dark charcoal with no flourish. His shoes shone faintly under the stage lights, but his satchel, the old one, still lay by the curtain off stage. He had insisted it stay close. He closed his eyes. The scent of polished wood, brass fixtures, and faint traces of rosin in the air surrounded him. Every inch of this hall was built for brilliance, and now it was waiting for him. A sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He turned. Daniel Atwood entered quietly, wearing a long coat that fluttered slightly with the cold he'd just left outside. He carried no score, no entourage, just a worn leather notebook clutched in one hand. His face bore the lines of someone who had known deep fame and deeper loss, and had learned the silence between the two. "You came early," Daniel said. Elliot nodded. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd sit with the silence before the sound." Daniel smiled faintly. "Amara used to say the same thing." Elliot looked at the empty seats. "Do you ever stop being afraid of the silence?" "No," Daniel replied. "You just stop letting it stop you." He walked forward, standing beside Elliot now, gazing out across the rows with him. "Tomorrow night," Daniel said, "every one of those seats will be filled. Press, musicians, critics, people who think they know what genius sounds like, people who have been waiting 12 years to hear how it ends." Elliot's throat tightened. And what if they don't understand? What if they don't feel it? Daniel looked at him, eyes calm. "Then that's their loss, not ours." Elliot let out a breath. His hand twitched slightly at his side, as if already reaching for the keys. Daniel extended the notebook to him. Elliot took it gently, opening it to reveal the original score of Amara's song, scribbled with changes, notes, tears in the paper. But at the bottom, in fresh ink, was a new inscription: "Final movement, for the brother who remembered her when I couldn't." Elliot swallowed hard, eyes burning. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "You carried it," Daniel said simply. "For 12 years, you carried it, without applause, without recognition, without ever once stopping." The quiet between them was thick now, soft, not suffocating. Daniel reached forward and placed his hand on Elliot's shoulder. "She would have been proud of you." That nearly broke him. Elliot turned his face away and blinked until the tears didn't fall. He folded the notebook closed and held it like something sacred. "I'll be ready." Daniel nodded. "We all will." That evening, they rehearsed in the dim hall, no audience, no lighting crew, no spectacle. Just Elliot and Daniel at the piano. Isabel sat in the 5th row, arms crossed gently, eyes closed the entire time. Each note floated through the air with reverence, grief, and grace. It wasn't just a rehearsal, it was a cleansing, a ritual. At one point, the music faltered. Elliot stopped, his hand trembling. The final passage, delicate and nearly impossible in its vulnerability, had slipped under his fingers. Daniel looked at him. "It's all right. That part was always meant to be fragile." Elliot's voice was barely a whisper. "But what if I ruin it tomorrow?" "You won't," Daniel said. "You can't." "Why?" Daniel smiled. "Because you're not playing it alone." They began again. This time, Elliot played the final notes with a gentleness that left the silence afterward buzzing with emotion. He lingered on the last chord, letting it hang in the rafters until it disappeared on its own terms. When they finished, Isabel stood. She clapped once, just once, whispered, "That's it." The next morning came quietly. Vienna stirred beneath a crisp layer of snow as music lovers, dignitaries, and skeptics alike arrived at the Musikverein, all of them drawn by rumors, by invitations with Daniel Atwood's name embossed in gold, by curiosity. Who was this unknown pianist? Why now? Why Vienna? Elliot waited in the wings. The murmur of the audience drifted through the curtains like fog. He could hear their heels, their programs, their low laughter, the same old orchestra pit, the same golden lights. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a stranger. He felt chosen. Daniel approached him one last time. He placed his hand over Elliot's heart. "Play from here," he said. "Not from memory, from truth." Elliot nodded. Then the announcer's voice filled the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, this evening's performance marks the world premiere of the completed Amara's Song, composed by Daniel Atwood, with final movements by Elliot Marsh. Tonight, we invite you to hear not just a melody, but a story, a memory, a homecoming." The applause was polite, curious, reserved. Elliot walked onto the stage. At first, the crowd was confused. No tuxedo, no fame. Just a man they didn't recognize, stepping toward the grand piano like he belonged there. He sat, he placed his fingers on the keys, and then he began. The same notes he'd once played in the corner of a hotel lobby now rose through the rafters of one of the world's greatest concert halls. But this time, they had room to breathe. This time, they had witnesses. And as the final, aching movement unfurled, so delicate it nearly broke the air itself, the audience leaned forward, their breath collectively stilled. There was no coughing, no programs shuffling, only sound, and the silent breaking of hearts. When the final note faded, Elliot lifted his hands gently from the keys. Silence, longer than usual, and then a standing ovation. The applause roared through the hall like thunder over the Danube. Some cried, some simply stood frozen, stunned by the quiet brilliance of what they had heard. Elliot didn't bow, he turned to the wings, and Daniel walked out to stand beside him. They bowed together. And in that moment, the world didn't see a famous composer and a nameless pianist. They saw two men who had lost the same woman and found each other through the music she left behind. The applause still echoed in Elliot's ears long after the lights dimmed and the audience poured out into the snowy Vienna streets. He remained backstage, tucked into a quiet corner with his satchel by his feet and his hands resting on his knees. His palms still carried the warmth of the keys, as though the final note had not yet released him. The world outside had shifted, he felt it, but inside, he was still wrapped in that last fragile chord. A gentle knock at the dressing room door broke the stillness. It opened slowly, revealing Isabel, her coat folded neatly over her arm, her expression soft but electric. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "You did it," she said. Elliot looked up, his voice low and calm. "I didn't think I could." "That," she replied, walking closer, "is why it meant so much." She reached into her bag and unfolded a tablet. On it, social media posts were already exploding with reactions. "Unknown pianist leaves Vienna speechless," read one headline. "Atwood's swan song shared by a stranger with the soul of a prophet," read another. Clips of the performance, filmed in secret by trembling hands, had gone viral before the final standing ovation had even ended. "You've become," Isabel said slowly, showing him the screen, "the most talked-about musician in the world right now." Elliot stared at it, then shook his head with a quiet, half-worn smile. "I didn't play for that." "I know," she said, "but that's why it's happening." Before he could respond, there was another knock. This time it was Daniel. He looked different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally been set down. His eyes were red but open, and when he looked at Elliot, he didn't see a pianist anymore. He saw family. "I've been asked to open the Royal Gala in London next month," Daniel said. "I told them I'd do it on one condition." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "That you bring your own bench?" Daniel gave a breath of a laugh. "That I don't play alone." Elliot's smile faded into something deeper, an understanding that this journey was no longer just about honoring the past, but shaping the future. Not a performance, a partnership. Still, he hesitated. "Daniel, I don't belong in that world." Daniel stepped closer, his voice firm but kind. The world doesn't need more polished performers. It needs truth, and you are truth. Elliot looked away, grappling silently with the echo of the imposter he'd carried all his life. The coat still felt too heavy. The room still too grand. But Amara's voice, faint, remembered, rose in his mind like morning light. You don't have to shine to be seen, Elliot. You just have to open the door. He looked up. All right, he said. But one more thing first. The next afternoon, Elliot returned to the lobby of the Astoria Grand Hotel. Snow clung to the edges of the windows, and the world bustled quietly around him. Tourists with cameras, businessmen with briefcases, families checking in for winter holidays, all unaware that a single note once transformed this space into something holy. The same piano stood in the corner, still untouched, still waiting. Elliot walked toward it. A staff member, young and unsure, stepped forward to intercept him. I'm sorry, sir, that piano's not, but a hand reached out and gently stopped the staff member. It was the hotel manager. She smiled at Elliot, her face warm with recognition and humility. Mr. Marsh, she said softly, we've been waiting for you. No fanfare, no cameras, just Elliot and the piano. He sat down. The first note was softer than a whisper, yet it rippled across the lobby like a memory coming home. The people around him paused, puzzled at first, then stilled as the melody began to breathe. But he didn't play Amara's song. Not this time. He played something new. A variation, a reflection. Music that didn't grieve the past but welcomed the future. It was lighter, full of warmth and restraint, like sunlight gently melting snow. And as he played, someone placed something behind him on a marble pedestal, a brass plaque. He didn't turn to read it, but later, when the music had stopped and the last guest had dried their eyes and wandered away, Elliot finally rose to look. It read, The Amara Keys. Dedicated to the woman who inspired a melody the world could never forget, and to the man who kept it alive until we were ready to hear it. He reached out and touched the edge of the plaque. Behind him, someone approached. A woman, around 50, modestly dressed, holding the hand of a young girl. Are you the man who played at the concert? She asked. Elliot nodded softly. My daughter hasn't stopped talking about the song. She lost her father this year. But when you played, she said it felt like he was talking to her. The little girl stepped forward and looked up at him. It made my heart feel warm again. Elliot knelt beside her. Then the music did its job, he said gently. It remembered him for you. She hugged him tightly, he closed his eyes, and in that simple, silent embrace, he understood. This was never about fame or stages or legacy. It was about people, one heart at a time. That night, Daniel called. They want us to record it, he said. For a global release, Vienna Philharmonic, Tokyo, Paris, New York. Elliot stood by his window watching the snow begin again. Then let's do it, he replied. But let's do it in her name. There was a pause. Then Daniel whispered, always. Elliot smiled. His fingers ached slightly, tired from playing, but more alive than they'd felt in years. He turned from the window, walked to the small upright piano in his room, and placed his hands on the keys once more. And somewhere in the quiet, the world listened. The crowd in Tokyo's Suntory Hall sat in respectful, reverent silence, the kind of hush that comes not from manners but from awe. The first half of the program had already stunned them. Classical masterpieces, intricate solos, and the sheer weight of Daniel Atwood's return to the world stage. But what they were about to hear next was no longer just music. It had become a movement. Elliot stood backstage in the narrow corridor, lined with red velvet curtains and centuries of pressure. The world now knew his name. The world now expected something from him. Yet in his chest, he didn't carry the thunder of acclaim. He carried something much older, quieter. Amara's laugh echoing in the corners of his memory, the smell of rain on a summer afternoon when she first taught him Middle C. And the breathless way she once said, Elliot, when you play, you listen better than anyone I've ever known. He took a breath, ran a hand over the back of his neck, and looked out at the rows of polished seats. Somewhere in that audience tonight was a stranger who needed to feel less alone. Somewhere, someone would hear a note that opened a locked door in their heart. He walked out, no words, no fanfare. Just Elliot in a black suit with time-worn hands and eyes that had traveled further than most people ever would. He sat, and once again he played. But this night, as the final note shimmered in the air and his hands slowly lifted from the keys, something shifted. Not in the music, not in the hall, but in the corner of the room. A woman stood alone, arms crossed, her face partially hidden beneath the brim of a wide black hat. She didn't clap, she didn't move, but her eyes, he felt them like heat. As if she wasn't just watching the performance, but searching through it. Elliot looked at her just for a second, and something trembled inside him. The moment passed, but it lingered. Backstage, the room buzzed with controlled celebration. Daniel embraced him, Isabel smiled with misty eyes, and concert organizers handed him fresh programs for the next tour city. Paris, then New York, then São Paulo. But Elliot couldn't focus. He kept glancing toward the side entrance to where that woman had stood. "Is something wrong?" Isabel asked gently. He nodded, but not in answer. "There was someone watching. I don't know why, but she felt familiar." "Someone from your past?" "I don't think so," he said. "But she knew something. I could feel it." Isabel tilted her head. "Describe her." Elliot tried. Hat, dark coat, silver streak in her hair. But it felt like trying to hold smoke. She'd been there, and yet somehow, not. "She didn't clap," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "Everyone else did. She didn't." Daniel approached, reading the unease in his old friend's face. "Maybe she'll come back," he said, voice calm. "Some truths take time to surface." But Elliot didn't want time. He wanted to know why his chest had tightened the moment their eyes met. 3 days later in Paris, as Elliot rehearsed in the empty Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, a folded note was left on the piano bench before the sound check. No envelope, no signature. Just 8 handwritten words in delicate, looping script. "You don't know the whole story yet." He stared at it, unmoving, then flipped it over. On the back, a name. Vivienne Hale. The name struck like a chime deep in his bones. Not loud, but undeniable. A sound he hadn't heard in years. It was Amara's roommate in conservatory, her closest friend, the one who vanished from all contact after the funeral, never returning calls, never replying to letters. Elliot had never known why, until now. That night, he searched the lobby after the performance, scanning every face, every doorway. She was there. Same coat, same eyes. This time, she didn't look away. He moved toward her. She didn't flinch. They met just outside the stage exit beneath the overhang of the theater's rear wall, Paris rain misting the air in a hush of gray. "Vivienne," he said. "Elliot," she answered, voice like cello and smoke. For a moment, there was only the sound of raindrops on stone. "Why now?" he asked. She looked away, jaw tight, "Because it was finally your song." "Not his." He blinked. "What do you mean?" Vivienne reached into her coat and pulled out a slim, aged envelope. She held it like a relic, careful, hesitant. She wrote this a week before she died. She asked me not to send it, said she wasn't ready, that if anything happened to her, I'd know when to deliver it. Elliot took it with trembling hands. His name was written on the front in Amara's unmistakable script. He stared at it. "Why didn't you come sooner?" he whispered. Vivienne's voice broke. "Because I was angry, at Daniel, at myself, and at her, for leaving, for hiding what she was going through. But when I heard you in Vienna," her throat caught. "She came back to me in that hall, and I knew it was time." Elliot looked down at the letter. He couldn't open it there, not standing beneath the storm. Vivienne placed a hand on his shoulder gently. "You'll know when." And then she was gone. That night, alone in his hotel room, Elliot sat by the window and held the letter beneath a warm lamp glow. He waited a long time, letting the edges of the paper speak first, letting his heart calm, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. Then, slowly, he opened it. The ink had faded in places, but the words were still hers. "Elliot, if you're reading this, I'm probably no longer in the world as you knew me. But I'm not gone. I am in every tea you touch, every breath you hold when the music swells. I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything. The truth is, I was sick, and I was afraid. Not of dying, but of being forgotten by the people I love the most. You were always the only person who listened with your whole soul. I knew that when I gave you my melody, it would be safe. You wouldn't just play it, you'd protect it. There's something you don't know. That song, it wasn't just mine and Daniel's, it was yours. You helped me write the first line that summer. You sat beside me and asked why sadness sounded so beautiful. I never told you, but that was the moment it began. So when you finish it, when the world finally hears what we created, don't give them perfection. Give them truth. I love you more than I ever had the words to say." Elliot folded the letter slowly, pressing it against his chest. Outside the window, Paris shimmered beneath the rain. And inside the room, a man who had spent years chasing fragments of a song now understood why it had always returned to him. It had never been Daniel's composition alone. It had always been theirs. Elliot stood beneath the vaulted glass of the New York Philharmonic lobby, his breath visible in the winter air that still clung to the edges of his coat. Outside, the wind howled past skyscrapers, and cabs sloshed through icy puddles under glowing marquees. Inside, the walls hummed with velvet voices and gleaming expectations. But Elliot wasn't listening. His hand remained tucked inside his breast pocket, fingers brushing against folded parchment. The letter. Amara's letter. Since reading it in that quiet Parisian hotel room, it had not left his side. He had not shown it to anyone. Not yet. Because he hadn't been ready, not for the truth it whispered, not for the reckoning it required. He looked up at the staircase where Daniel stood alone, leaning over the railing and watching the crowd form below. Spotlights shimmered off his silvered hair. For a man once heralded as the maestro of modern emotion, he looked smaller tonight, tired, wary, waiting for a weight he couldn't name to lift. Elliot climbed the stairs slowly. When he reached the top, he said nothing at first. Just stood beside Daniel, shoulder to shoulder, as they watched the guests below settle into their crimson seats. Daniel didn't look at him, but he spoke. "You're quieter than usual." "I have something," Elliot said, voice steady. "Something I need you to read." That got Daniel's attention. He turned, brows furrowed. Elliot drew the letter from his pocket and offered it. Daniel hesitated, then took it gently in both hands. He unfolded the page, recognizing the handwriting instantly. His breath caught before he even reached the first word. He read it once, then again. And when he finished, he didn't speak. His hands trembled. Elliot waited. Finally, Daniel lowered the letter and looked out across the mezzanine, his voice raw. "She never told me. She didn't tell me either. She told Vivienne, asked her to wait, said we weren't ready." Daniel swallowed hard. "I never knew you wrote music." "I didn't," Elliot said. "Not in the way you think, but I remember sounds, and I asked questions. I was just a boy with too many feelings and not enough words." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "She always said sadness needed translators." "She translated me," Elliot whispered. Daniel nodded, eyes shining. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Elliot said, gently, "That melody you thought you started, she and I had been building it years before she met you. You made it grander. She made it timeless, but its first note was born on a porch swing during a thunderstorm." Daniel blinked hard. His voice shook. "She never needed to be remembered through my legacy. She had her own. She still does." A silence deeper than music fell between them, not painful, not hostile, just honest. Then Elliot spoke again. "You and I, we've been performing something that belonged to her. But now we know, it belongs to us too. And if we keep playing it, we need to say so, publicly. In her name." Daniel looked at him with a gaze that stripped away fame, pride, and ego. "You think the world will understand?" "No," Elliot said. "But the truth doesn't need the world's permission." Daniel pressed his lips together, closed his eyes, and nodded once. "We tell them," he said quietly, "at the end of the performance." Elliot felt something inside him unclench. They descended the stairs together, not as mentor and protege, not as composer and interpreter, but as two men carrying the same ghost, finally walking at the same pace. The performance that night felt different, not heavier, freer. When they stepped on stage, the hall buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the balcony. Music critics readied their pens. The nation watched, waiting for technical brilliance. But they received something else entirely. Elliot opened the concert not with the famed motif of Amara's song, but with a new melody. A soft, unsure beginning, woven with the curiosity of a child, the intimacy of a shared secret. It was gentle, quiet, and daring in its vulnerability. It asked for patience, and it received it. Then Daniel joined, not to lead, but to listen, to follow. And together, they let the composition rise not as a statement, but as a confession. The climax didn't thunder. It whispered. And when they reached the final chord, they let it linger. Not because the hall demanded it, but because it needed to breathe. As the last note dissolved, Daniel stood and turned to the microphone. The audience expected a thank you, maybe a political nod, or a tour announcement, but what came was silence. And then Daniel's voice, hoarse and steady. "This piece you heard tonight is not mine alone, and it never was. Murmurs flickered through the hall. It began on a rainy porch with 2 children and a piano that barely held tune. It grew in kitchens, in laughter, in shared grief. And tonight I stand beside the man who helped create it, though he didn't know he had until recently. Elliot Marsh is not just a performer, he is a co-author of this legacy. Gasps rippled, flashbulbs burst, hands covered mouths. Daniel raised the letter above his head. She left us a message. One we didn't deserve, but we honor it tonight. He looked at Elliot, and Elliot stepped forward. His voice was quieter, but somehow stronger. My sister gave her life to beauty. Not fame, not prestige. She asked us to play this piece, not for applause, but so that no one in this world would feel that their story needed permission to be heard. A long beat. Then, we give this to you, as it was meant to be. The standing ovation rose not like a roar, but like a prayer. No shouts, no cheers. Just a wall of human gratitude rising on its feet and filling the room with the quietest, deepest kind of reverence. And in the glow of those lights, in the shelter of that truth, Amara came home. The morning after the performance, Elliot woke to silence, not the empty kind that haunted him for years, but the kind that lingered like dew, gentle and honest, holding stillness without loneliness. Sunlight spilled through the curtains of his New York hotel room, warm against the faded letter still resting on the nightstand, beside his glasses, his cufflinks, and a small glass of water he never drank. He reached for the letter first, not to read it again. He didn't need to. The words were etched now, not just in his memory, but in the way his hands moved, the way his music breathed. Still, it calmed him, the feel of it, a pulse from the past reminding him he was not a fraud. He was her echo. He dressed slowly. There was no rehearsal today, no cameras, no microphones. Just time, that strange companion who once felt like a curse and now had learned how to sit beside him quietly without interrupting. When he finally checked his phone, he found it overflowing. Messages, mentions, tags, not from celebrities, not from newspapers, from strangers, from everywhere. Hundreds of them. A single mother in Nairobi who had watched the concert live and wept because her son, who hadn't spoken in 6 months, whispered the word music when the final note ended. A violin teacher in Warsaw who said she abandoned her career after a tragedy. But something in Elliot's performance had made her take her old instrument out of its case. A retired janitor from St. Louis who had written a full page in longhand saying, "I've never played a note in my life, but last night made me believe I still have a story to tell." He read them all, some twice. Then he reached a message that stopped him cold. It came from a small town in North Carolina. No profile picture, no subject line, just a single sentence. "There's another melody," she wrote, "one you've never heard." The sender's name was simply ML. He read it again and again. Then sat down at the desk, pulled the hotel's notepad toward him, and scribbled every possibility. ML, Marion Lake? Michael Langston? Martin Lowell? He didn't recognize the name. But something in the tone, the certainty, it didn't feel like a hoax, it felt deliberate. He stared at the screen, fingers poised to reply. "How do you know that?" He hit send. The response came 4 minutes later, "Because she gave it to me, and told me never to share it, unless someone played her song the way you did." He blinked. His breath caught. Then another message arrived. "If you're ready, come to Asheville. There's something she left behind, something even Daniel doesn't know." Elliot sat motionless for nearly an hour. Then he booked a flight. The road to Asheville was lined with bare trees stretching toward a gray sky, their limbs skeletal and graceful, like dancers frozen mid-bow. Elliot drove a rental car through winding hills, past old wooden signs and rusted fences. It was quiet country, honest, unhurried, a place where memories settled into the soil and stayed for generations. The address took him to a modest cottage at the edge of a hill, framed by leafless oaks and a single rocking chair that creaked slightly in the wind. He parked, heart pounding, and approached slowly. The door opened before he could knock. The woman who stood there was in her 60s, her face lined with time and truth, her hair silver at the temples. She wore a faded flannel shirt and soft jeans, no makeup, no smile, just eyes that knew him the moment they saw him. "You're Elliot," she said. He nodded. "You're ML." "I am." She stepped aside and let him in. The cottage smelled of cedar, old paper, and lemon tea. Everything was soft here. Woven rugs, threadbare pillows, windows that let in long ribbons of afternoon light. On the mantel, a photo of Amara, young, laughing, arms around a much younger woman. ML. She called me Mira, the woman said, noticing Elliot's gaze. Short for Miranda Lee. I was her friend long before Vienna. We met in Carolina. Played together in a church basement when we were 13. Elliot stepped closer to the photo. She never told me about this place. She didn't tell many people, Mira said gently. It was where she came when everything else was too loud. He turned to her. You said there was something she left behind. Mira nodded and walked to a cabinet. She opened a drawer and carefully removed a slim, linen-covered folder. She placed it on the coffee table between them. I didn't read it, she said. She made me promise, said one day someone would come who had earned it. Elliot sat down slowly and opened the folder. Inside were 4 sheets of sheet music, handwritten. But they weren't just notes, they were letters. Each bar of music was followed by a line of prose, written in Amara's voice. He read the first line aloud, his throat tightening. To the soul I never thought I'd have to leave behind. It wasn't a score, it was a farewell, a final composition, a message hidden in melody. She had written it for him. The tears came quietly, no sobs, no gasps, just steady streams down a face carved by years of silence. He touched the paper as if it might dissolve. She wrote this just for me? Mira nodded. She said you were the only one who would understand what to do with it. Elliot looked up, eyes shimmering. What should I do with it? Mira didn't answer. She simply placed a hand over his. You already know. And in that moment, he did. This wasn't a piece for a concert hall. It wasn't meant for thunderous ovations or polished stages. This was something smaller, something sacred, a lullaby for those still haunted by goodbye, a love letter in the language of grief. He closed the folder and pressed it to his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was chasing her ghost. He felt like she had been walking beside him all along. The chapel was small, not grand like the cathedrals Elliot had once played in. No stained glass, no echoing domes, no velvet pews, just whitewashed walls, simple wooden beams, and rows of folding chairs that creaked with every breath. At the front sat a second-hand upright piano, keys yellowed at the edges, its lacquer worn by time and touch. But it was perfect. This was where Amara had written her first melody, where her laughter once bounced off walls not built to contain beauty, where she sat with Mira in the summer heat, playing hymnals between jokes and dreams, barefoot, unpolished, free. This wasn't a stage. It was a beginning. Elliot stood in the doorway, hands buried in his coat pockets, the folder containing Amara's final composition tucked securely under his arm. The morning light came through high windows like a hush. No audience, no announcement, just him. Then her. He stepped forward. The piano welcomed him with a groan, as if waking from a long sleep. He sat, rested the folder gently on the music rack, and opened it. Each page, every note, felt like a breath she never got to take. His fingers hovered. He didn't warm up. He didn't rehearse. He just began. The first few notes were tentative, unsure, a question, not a declaration. A whisper in a quiet room. The kind of opening that begged the listener to lean in rather than pull back. And then it grew. Not in volume, but in depth. Each measure unfolded like a confession, a conversation between memory and melody. There were moments that felt like her voice, bright, dancing, unapologetically complex. But then the piece shifted into something he didn't expect. Silence. An entire measure of rest. Elliot's fingers paused, and in that space he felt her absence like a hand on his chest. The next phrase began in a lower register, heavy and slow, as though written during a time of private mourning. The melody wasn't trying to rise, it was trying to stay, to hold on to something slipping away. His hands moved like they were being guided. Each note landed softly, like a falling leaf, until suddenly, a high E sharp, isolated, a single cry. And then, a resolution, warm, gentle, forgiving. The piece ended not with grandeur, but with grace. A final chord so fragile it barely held together, like a bird folding its wings for the last time. When he lifted his hands, the silence in the room felt sacred. Elliot closed the folder, and for a long moment he simply sat, listening to the stillness. Then he heard the sound, a soft rustling behind him. He turned. At the back of the chapel, standing just inside the doorway, was a woman holding a toddler to her chest. Behind her, more people gathered. Some elderly, some children, some dressed plainly, some in Sunday best. One by one they had come, drawn not by invitation but by sound. Locals, passers-by, travelers who'd followed a story and found something else entirely. Elliot rose slowly. The woman at the door stepped forward. "Was that her last piece?" she asked softly. Elliot nodded. "Yes." She placed a hand on her heart. "Then I think she's finally home." The people began to file in, slowly, respectfully, taking their seats. Someone whispered, "Will he play again?" Another voice, "I hope so." And Elliot, who once feared silence more than rejection, took a long breath and sat once more. He didn't need lights. He didn't need cameras. He didn't even need the pages. Because now her music was in him. And so he began again. But this time not alone. A small boy in the second row began humming along, the melody instinctively weaving into his breath. An older woman closed her eyes and nodded gently to the rhythm. A teenage girl wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, her violin case resting at her side like a secret she'd kept too long. It wasn't a concert. It was a communion. And as the final notes rose through the chapel rafters, Elliot knew. This was where Amara's song was always meant to live. Not on the lips of critics, not in the gold leaf of programs, but in the hearts of strangers who understood that grief, when given melody, can become love. When he stood again, the room was still. He looked at them all, those whose names he didn't know, whose stories he hadn't heard, and he felt Amara's presence not as absence, but as echo. She had trusted him, not to preserve her, but to free her. Later that evening, Mira sat beside him outside the chapel, watching the sky turn lilac as dusk fell across the hills. She wanted it to be simple, Mira said quietly. Not easy, but honest. Elliot nodded. She got her wish. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like something had ended. He felt like something had begun. The lights inside Royal Albert Hall dimmed slowly, deliberately, until only the soft golden rim of the stage remained, like a halo suspended in silence. The audience, thousands of them gathered from across the world, sat in perfect stillness. No murmuring, no shifting. It was not a silence born of formality, it was reverence. They had come not just to hear music, but to witness something that had outgrown even the legend of Daniel Atwood, or the mystique of Elliot Marsh. They had come for her. Backstage, Elliot stood alone beside the curtain. The familiar black suit hugged his frame, but this time he wore no tie. His collar was unbuttoned, his hands relaxed. In his breast pocket, folded neatly, was Amara's final handwritten composition. Not for reference, but for grounding. The world now knew. Not the tabloids, not the headlines, the people. They knew the truth. That the piece they had listened to in New York and Vienna, Tokyo and Paris, had not been the work of a single genius, but the echo of a sister and brother who had loved without spectacle and created without seeking credit. A song that had bloomed between porch swings and childhood secrets and found its voice through grief. Daniel stepped beside him now, dressed in a deep navy suit that somehow made him look both older and gentler. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The past 10 months had been an unspoken dialogue between them. Each performance a sentence, each silence a shared truth. "She's here," Daniel said at last. Elliot nodded, looking out past the curtain slit toward the crowd. "She always was." As the stage manager gave the cue, it was time. Elliot walked out first. No introduction, just presence. He stepped into the light as the audience rose to their feet in quiet unity, not applauding, not cheering, just rising like a tide acknowledging the moon. He bowed his head once, then sat. Daniel joined him at the second bench, and then a single microphone descended slowly from above. Elliot reached for it, and the hush in the hall deepened. He waited a breath, then two. Then began. "When I first played this melody," he said softly, "it was in a hotel lobby with no one listening, or so I thought. I carried it for years, not because I wanted to be heard, but because I was afraid of forgetting the voice that gave it to me." He glanced down for a moment, then back up. "My sister Amara once said that music doesn't fix grief, it teaches it how to move." A murmur stirred the silence. She left behind a final piece, one she never performed, one she entrusted to someone who never imagined it would matter. "But tonight, I offer it, not as a performance, but as a gift, from her, to all of us." He stepped back, then sat. Daniel opened the folder and nodded, and they began. Amara's final composition didn't rise like a curtain call. It emerged like light seeping through a door cracked open. It didn't command, it invited. The music moved slowly, almost shyly, as though aware of the sacredness it carried. The piece spoke in layers. The left hand told of childhood, of muddy shoes and shared laughter, of lullabies played on chipped keys. The right hand told of departure, of things unsaid, of promises kept in silence. And together they wove a third voice, hers. It was there, in the aching suspension between phrases, the spaces where the breath catches before the tears fall. The audience felt it, visibly, heads bowed, eyes closed, hands clenched to hearts. And when Elliot struck the final chord, delicate, uncertain, resolving not into triumph but into peace, it held in the air like a whispered blessing. Then he lifted his hands. Silence. A silence that did not beg to be broken. Until finally, someone stood. Then another. Then the entire hall. Still no applause, just stillness. Until a child's voice from somewhere in the balcony rang out, pure and high and small, "Thank you." And the spell broke. The applause rose, not as noise but as gratitude, not as celebration but as recognition. Elliot stood slowly, turned to Daniel and embraced him. They walked off the stage together. Backstage, Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She would have laughed," he whispered. "She'd have hated the fuss." "She never wanted to be famous," Elliot said. "No, just heard." Outside in the velvet dark of the London night, people gathered around the entrance steps. No autographs, no interviews, just strangers lighting candles, holding hands, mourning someone they never met, and celebrating the legacy she left in their hearts. Elliot stepped into the quiet. He took out Amara's letter and reread it by the glow of the street lamp, his breath forming small clouds as he smiled through the ache. "Don't give them perfection," she had written. "Give them truth." He had, and in doing so, had found his own. Weeks later, Elliot returned to the little chapel in Asheville. Not to play, just to sit. Mira joined him with tea and silence. A child practiced violin faintly in the distance. Birds sang through the open windows, and time moved without rushing. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a slip of paper, a new composition, scribbled over weeks of sleepless nights and sudden tears. It was his, not Amara's, not Daniel's, his. He placed it on the music rack, then played, not for anyone, not even her, just for the moment. And when the final note fell, he didn't smile. He smiled. He knew he would never stop carrying her music. But now, at last, he could begin writing his own. What began as a quiet song in a hotel lobby became something no one could have imagined. A journey of grief, truth, and unspoken love that echoed across the world. Elliot Marsh didn't seek the spotlight. He wasn't chasing applause. All he wanted was to remember the sister he lost. But in choosing honesty over perfection, silence over spectacle, he did more than remember her. He restored her voice, and through it, healed countless others. This story is a reminder that legacy isn't about fame, it's about the hearts we reach when no one's watching. It's about the courage to carry someone's memory, not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. We don't always choose the songs we carry. Sometimes they choose us. And when they do, we must honor them, not with grandeur, but with truth. So if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or unsure of your voice in a world too loud, remember Elliot, remember Amara. And know this, the quietest stories often hold the deepest power. The smallest melodies can shake the world, and somewhere, someone is still listening, waiting for your truth to begin.